Yep, another long multiple choice test, but the good news, aside from this being the last long multiple choice test, is that there is no separate image-based test this time. Even better news is that the dates are really easy. They're also important. Past AP questions have required students to choose a work after 1960. I'm talking about essay questions here. Now, it would not at all surprise me if you were asked to find a work after 1980. So you need to know which works fall into the College Board's final global contemporary content area. Note that this unit includes some from the content area that they label a later European and Western art. There will be a few attribution questions. I don't think they're hard, but you do want to make sure you know the artists of all your works by name. I recommend reviewing the artist matching questions again if you need a refresher. So what labels are applied to these works? They're both called the New York School, but unlike the color block paintings of Rothko, which were made by slowly layering paint, these were fill in the blank. And what does it mean to call these works painterly? How did Jackson Pollock apply paint? You'll notice I've kept some old questions about Jackson Pollock, even though he's off the list. How does the work on the left break from the work of Pollock and others in the New York School? What method did this artist use, and what effect was she trying to achieve? Why was her work labeled post-painterly abstraction? What other works in this course are in this unit are site-specific? How does the environment of this work affect the viewer's interaction with it and interpretation of it? Where is this work located? What earlier work from our course might have inspired Robert Smithson? Think earthworks. How does the environment of this work affect the viewer's perspective? And how does that perspective and the work change? I thought this was a poorly worded question. I stuck it in anyway, but I've given you a really big hint on the lower right. What major change in Western art did these works represent? How did they differ from traditional outside art, such as, for example, the burghers of Calais? What terms are used to describe the structure of these works? Two different terms. Think medieval altarpieces. What technique was used for the work on the left? What are the advantages of that technique? Remember that Warhol made a fortune from these works. And remember, too, that the method did not result in perfect reproduction. Serigraphy is the term for silk screening, and you do need to know it. What contextual factors influenced the work on the right? What was the background and early artistic experience of the artist, and how does this show up in his work? What is the subject of the newspaper articles included in this collage? What social commentary is the artist making with this work? By the way, there are a lot of answers to that question, but only one of the choices is going to make sense. What earlier medium is this artist imitating, sort of? I talked about this in my podcast, although it wasn't in your homework reading. What feature of this work especially challenges the viewer? That's another one where there's more than one possible answer, but only one of the answers will make sense, and I'm going to give you a really big hint. Why was the use of an overhead projector challenging and disturbing to viewers? Why did the artist of this work come under criticism from the communist authorities in China? What, in a broad sense, is this work communicating? I find the question and answer rather vague, by the way, but I think the answer will be pretty obvious, and you've seen this question before. What was the historical inspiration for this artist's medium? What do the characters actually say? What historical and personal experience heavily influenced this work and is at least implicitly criticized in this work? What was the artist's formal intention in creating this and, here's a big hint, his other famous works? Remember what kind of sculptures he did? What political event does this work reference? What point is this artist making about the female persona? Okay, the artist of the work on top was associated with what late 20th century art movement? I talked about this in my podcast, and I'm including a hint on the bottom right. How does this work combine references to both high and low culture? Specifically, what element of high culture is represented? I talked about this in my podcast. What was the greatest influence on the artist in creating this work? You need to know his personal history and experience, which experiences really influenced this. What innovative primary building material did the artist choose? What local tradition and local history does the shape of this building reference? And what is the term used for this kind of architecture? How is the visitor intended to see and interact with this memorial? What is the significance of descending into the ground? Where is the memorial located, and why is that specific location significant? How was the design chosen? What was the response to the original design, and how did the committee modify the plans for this memorial? By the way, there are a lot of questions on this work, since I have some from earlier exams. If you don't remember it very well, or if you missed that day, go back and review the podcast. What artistic movement especially influenced Maya Lin's design? Again, I talked about this in my podcast, and I'm offering a big hint on the right. That's a work that used to show up a lot on AP exams, so it's off the list. Why did the artist choose to employ polished black granite? What are some similarities and differences between these two buildings? Warning, you need to know what a balustrade is and where it might appear on one or both of these works. What label, what school that is applied to the work on the bottom. So what's the meaning attached to these particular cans? What other earlier works from our course also make use of recycled materials? What works from this unit make use of recycled materials? What social conditions among Pacific Islanders is this artist referencing and indeed criticizing? Which of our artists was influenced by early fabric works, such as this 19th century quilt, which is now in the Brooklyn Museum? Why did this artist choose to work in this particular medium? What formal element do these works have in common? You're going to have to think about that, but I think you'll understand it when you see it. With reference to the work on the upper left, what material is it made from, and what significance might that material have? What element adds to its uniqueness? Hint, each time it's shown. What do these figures symbolize? What message is the artist sending about the human condition? Why does she choose burlap as her medium? What impression does it create? Why would this work have been placed in the center of an exhibit space? I didn't precisely talk about this, but I think it should be fairly obvious. What does the viewer see by walking around it? How does it look different from the front and back? Where was this work constructed and how? Remember, we don't know exactly how. To what does the crack allude or refer? What is the significance of the title, and what is the word's modern meaning or connotation? By the way, you've seen these questions before. What historical legacy is this artist exploring and critiquing? What modern-day social problem is she referencing? Two different questions. What cultural and cross-cultural references are included in this work? That's another question I think you've seen before. Which other earlier required work uses the same medium as the sunflower seeds? And how were the sunflower seeds made? What was the process? We talked about that and saw a video. The structural composition and underlying layer of this painting is grounded in what traditions or types of work? Hint, who and what influenced this artist's work? Also, what two media are applied in layers? Now, I didn't actually talk about this in my podcast, oops, but the information is included in the identifying medium for this work. And as a further hint, remember that ink is used for drawing as well as for painting. What larger themes do these images evoke? Remember, we don't know what kind of stadium is being pictured, or even whether it's a stadium at all. The artist refuses to say. Hence, it could even represent a legislature or a crowd rioting, anywhere the groups gather to create energy, chaos, and exchange. We do know that it has a theme of globalization and globalism. What artist from our last unit produced rather similar abstract images? What earlier tradition does this work reference? And finally, how does the painting on top differ from other Pacific art? I'm giving you a huge hint here. Well, good luck on your last multiple choice question. Next, we move on to two separate second semester finals.